I think Bernie, he that's why I think he pulled away to make that point that, you know what, because I imagine, and as has been the case, there's loads of people have said, well, the red flag helped him get ahead of George and Lando. But I think he wanted to win by such a big margin to prove that he could have done a pit stop even without and actually, funny enough, you look at the gap at the end, it was 23 seconds to George, which is basically a pit stop.
A pit stop, isn't it? Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was very much about trying to prove that point.
George Russell called it. Max Verstappen capitalized, and now F1 fans are questioning everything. Watch this.
I was actually going to save this for later, but I think this is a good time to bring this in. I've got two questions, and we can spend as long or as little time on this as we want. Two questions about silly Formula One things at the moment. Number one, changing tyres under a red flag has obviously come into light again this weekend, and the fairness of that. Obviously, if sometimes it works for you, sometimes it doesn't work for you. Clearly, this weekend it didn't work for Lando Norris because Max Verstappen was allowed to change his tyres under a red flag. Karine, do you have a strong feeling now about whether that rule should change, or do you think it's as it is okay?
Look, the rule is primarily brought in from a safety perspective, right? Because if there was an accident, normally if there's a red flag, it's because of an accident. And normally if there's an accident, there's debris, on the track, and the cars might have run over the debris. So from a safety perspective, they brought the rule in to allow people to get rid of those tires. But from a sporting perspective, it is unfair. It is, I think, unfair to anyone who's got essentially a free pit stop. So I don't have a strong view as to what the answer is, because I think you have to consider the safety element. So whether there's some sort of way that you create an equalizer and say, I don't know, if you do a pit stop, if you change tires under red flag, you get 10 seconds added, or so, I don't know. There's got to be some way of creating some sort of balance, I think, to it, or maybe you have to go further back in the queue in terms of you add a certain amount of time and work out where you would be in the queue and positioning. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't think it's just a question of saying, we got to stop that rule, because there will be people who've got cuts to the tire and will get punctures, and then we'll have another crash, which is obviously not good for the sport.
Max Verstappen's use of the red flag rule was a masterclass in strategy. While some might call it unfair, the reality is he played within the rules and outsmarted the competition. This highlights the need for clarity in F1 regulations without undermining drivers' tactical decisions.
Yeah, what Karen's highlighted there is exactly why we have the regulation that we have. But even think of it in this wet condition. We've had a safety car, everyone's been driving quite slowly. Everyone comes into the pit lane under the red flag, even slower than that. They all line up in the pit lane. Actually, to get those intermediates back to a temperature that they're going to be okay on the outlap is mainly the reason why a lot of people change the tyres. So that's why they're changing it at that point in time. So you can't have everyone leave the pit lane on very, very cold intermediates. Or if that's the situation, they're not allowed to change, you wait longer for them to get back up to the 60 degree that the inters are at. So I do appreciate the rules there. I think in dry conditions, one of the solutions would be not allow that to be your mandatory pit stop. So change tyres if you want, but that's not your mandatory pit stop. Obviously in wet conditions, they don't have a mandatory pit stop. So a bit more of an uncertainty there. But I don't think with the best will in the world, we're going to get away from being able to change tyres under red flags. I think the bigger problem for me here, and again, sorry, I keep preempting what you might actually come on to in the podcast, so I'm sorry for leading the way, but the bigger problem for me is that in this race, I think 3 or 4 people changed to full wets at a point.
Max Verstappen's team showcased their adaptability by handling the red flag situation with precision. These moments highlight why F1 is as much about strategy as it is about speed. Adjustments to the rule mustn't dilute this aspect of the sport.
This was my question.
Sorry,
my question.
You asked
no,
question,
I'm pleased.
And then I'll come back.
No. I'm pleased you asked it because basically my question was, what is the point of wet tyres?
Well, so this is my gripe, and this is my current, frustration with what happened on Sunday. And it's happened many times in the past, but we get to a point where drivers are on track complaining about track condition. Some drivers have stopped to fit a new intermediate because the current intermediate's too worn for the condition. Some drivers have stopped for a fall wet. That's their freedom of choice to choose which tyres they want. But the drivers that haven't stopped, and in particular, from what I gathered,
Is the problem really with wet tires, or is it how teams and drivers hesitate to use them? Max Verstappen's consistency often comes from strategic decisions. Should others learn from that instead of blaming the conditions?
Max Verstappen and Esteban Ocon are then complaining very heavily about track condition, whether Max in particular calls out directly the FIA and the race director that there should be a red flag at a point where he had gains an advantage from it. Now, it's not for me to say if the track condition alone was enough for a red flag. I think the race director stood his ground significantly in not creating a red flag until the Colapinto accident. But the Colapinto accident happened on intermediate tyres in much, much worse conditions because drivers, teams, whatever, are resistant to take the pit stop to a full wet. And then it becomes this, can we hang it out on the wrong tyre, hoping for a red flag? So something needs to happen either to expand the window of the wet weather tyre that they can be fitted earlier and last longer when the conditions start to dry. But we had this period of 5 or 10 minutes really, really heavy rain, and everyone just trying to eke it out through that period, whatever way possible. And that creates the red flag. So I'm glad based on the conditions alone it didn't go to a red flag, but it is a pity that someone had an accident because they were on the wrong tyres, potentially wrong tyres for that condition at that time. So that's a frustration to me because in qualifying in Q1, everyone ran the wet tyres because they were the right tyres for that condition. In these conditions, they're happy to eke it out on 23 lap old inters and complain that conditions are too bad and almost demand a red flag. And that's, I'm not listening to everyone yet, but particularly the people that would benefit from the red flag were complaining very heavily about conditions in order to try and get the red flag.
This scenario highlights a critical flaw in F1's approach to wet weather racing. Verstappen's criticism of the FIA for not red flagging sooner is valid, but it also points to a systemic issue where teams prioritize strategy over safety. The reluctance to switch to full wets puts everyone at risk, and clearer rules are needed to address this dangerous trend.
But also, I think if we didn't have the red flag, if Colapinto hadn't crashed, we didn't have a red flag, it would have been interesting to see what happened. I was talking to Alex Albon at the airport and Colapinto, and they were both saying it would have been interesting because the RBs went onto the full wet and actually seemed to have a lot of pace at that point. So it would have been interesting to see, if they had come through. Because one of the things, Matt, is when those conditions got worse, we saw massive gaps. That lap when the rain really came down, Ocon made 4.5 seconds on Max and made 6 seconds on Gasly. He found visibility and a bit more grip, and he took a bit more risk maybe. But then further back, the RBs were finding like 10 seconds on the cars around them, right? So I think it is interesting just with the way it is at the moment with the tires. The full wet tire works in such a small window. And so the RBs would have gained a ton of time. But then when the rain stopped, they would have had to stop again and lose 25 seconds to go back. So, it would have been interesting to see just how that played out. But I think, there's a bit of George Russell radio, isn't there, that's come out where he's going, let's not pit, it's going to go red, let's not pit, it's going to go red, stay out. And they tell him to box, and then he goes, I told you it's going to go red when they called the red flag. And I get the frustration from it, right? I think from a team's perspective, they're going, well, your intermediates are quite old. It's the same call Mercedes made. The intermediates are quite old. If there's more rain coming, let's, give you a bit more tread. Let's be safe and stay out there. But yeah, I think, Alpine rolled the dice, didn't they? And Verstappen rolled the dice and by staying out. So yeah, okay, they were fortuitous the way it happened, but they also made that call, and took the gamble to stay out.
Max and the team's decision to stay out wasn't just luck. It was a masterclass in understanding timing and conditions. While others struggled with visibility and grip, Verstappen's control under worsening conditions was a testament to why he dominates the grid.
Just final point on the wet tyres. The reason why I say what is the point of full wet tyres is because you look at the conditions as a fan sitting at home and you go, I mean, if this isn't full wet, what are these for? And I know it might be different when you guys were there, but that was kind of, if you're never going to use them then, when on earth would you use them? But Bernie, like you're saying, from a sporting sense, and I guess that's where the potential danger comes if you're offsetting like safety versus sporting, it kind of maybe that decision should be taken out of the hands of the teams and put into the hands of the FIA. Is that kind of a summation?
I think we'd all be outraged if at the point people stopped for wet, the FIA came on and said everyone must stop to wet, because then there's no strategy, there's no driver. The drivers that survived on the Inter, Verstappen, Ocon and Gasly in particular, did exceptionally well to survive on those intermediates, and that can't be taken away from them at all. I just think it is wrong that drivers hang it out hoping that someone else crashes and creates a red flag. That doesn't seem like the right way to go with it. For those at home that are saying, if this isn't wet conditions, what is? You're totally right. It is wet conditions. And the laps that Corinne's talking about, I think on one of the laps, Perez, who's on full wet, gains 12 seconds in a lap over Verstappen on a Inter. So 12 seconds, that's 2 laps, he would have gained the pit stop back. So the wet is entirely the correct tyre for those conditions. Now, if all 20 cars were on wet, would we have been able to survive that period of rain without an accident to cause the red flag? We don't know the answer to that. We don't know, but there would have been a much, much better chance of surviving without the red flag. So hopefully it comes up in the drivers' meeting, in the FIA review of what happened, because we don't want to be avoided. We want to be avoiding these accidents as much as we possibly can. We've done a lot in F1 over the years to improve safety, and it's frustrating to see that willed away by people trying to avoid another 23-second or 24-second pit stop. But yeah, the viewers at home, you are right. It was full wet weather conditions. So it's not that the tyres weren't working. They were working. It's that people strategically were thinking, how do we avoid having to make one stop to the wet and another stop to the Inter? But at that point, if the race had been allowed to continue without the red flag, that would have been quicker than fitting an intermediate and staying on that intermediate.
The strategic gamble on intermediates in full wet conditions reflects a deeper issue in F1. While Perez showed the potential of the wet tires by gaining 12 seconds in a lap, many teams hesitated due to the time penalty of additional stops. This approach, hoping for red flags instead of managing the conditions effectively, puts unnecessary risks on the table. A unified approach by the FIA, emphasizing safety over strategy in such conditions, could help avoid these situations in the future.